The strongest men don't always break in battle. Sometimes they break in silence. I hadn't slept for 43 hours. The doctors would probably have called it exhaustion. My security team called it dedication. I called it Tuesday. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed 3 slow notes as afternoon sunlight slipped through the towering windows of Romano Manor, painting long golden lines across the marble floor. The mansion was quiet, almost unnaturally so. A place built for power rarely knew peace. Even the air carried discipline. Every polished surface reflected order. Every hallway echoed with footsteps that always belonged to someone waiting for my next decision. I loosened my tie as I walked into the living room, ignoring the untouched espresso cooling on the walnut coffee table. My phone vibrated again. Another message. Another problem demanding immediate attention. A shipment delayed. Lawyers requesting signatures. Investors asking questions. Men expecting answers only I could give. I muted the phone without reading the latest notification. For the first time in years, I simply couldn't care for another 5 minutes. My body felt heavier than the tailored suit draped across my shoulders. The leather sofa, imported from Italy because someone insisted only the best belonged in my home, suddenly looked more inviting than any luxury hotel bed ever had. I lowered myself onto it with a slow exhale, closing my eyes just long enough to rest them. Just 5 minutes, I promised myself. 5 quiet minutes before becoming Adrian Romano again. Somewhere in the distance, I heard soft footsteps followed by the gentle squeak of a cleaning cart rolling across hardwood floors. Emily Carter always arrived before noon. She moved through the mansion almost invisibly, never disturbing meetings, never asking unnecessary questions, never pretending the headlines about me didn't exist. She simply worked. Dust disappeared. Floors gleamed. Rooms felt lived in again. She treated the mansion like a home instead of a fortress. There was something strangely comforting about that. Today wasn't a school day, which meant her 3-year-old son, Noah, had come with her. I'd noticed him once before sitting quietly in the kitchen coloring dinosaurs while Emily folded laundry. He had smiled at one of my guards without the slightest hint of fear. The guard, a former Marine with a permanent frown, had smiled back before quickly pretending it never happened. Children had that effect on people. Even men trained never to lower their guard. My breathing slowed as fatigue finally claimed the argument my mind had been losing for days. The ticking clock faded. The distant hum of the city disappeared behind thick stone walls. Somewhere nearby, Emily's voice floated gently through the house. "Remember our rule, sweetheart," she whispered. "When someone looks tired, we let them rest." A tiny voice answered with perfect seriousness. "Even superheroes?" Emily laughed softly. "Especially superheroes." I never heard what happened next. Sleep, unexpected and impossibly deep, wrapped itself around me before I realized I had surrendered to it. While somewhere beyond my closed eyes, the smallest pair of footsteps in the mansion quietly began walking toward the sofa. I woke because something warm rested against my hand. For one confused second, I thought I was dreaming. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the amber sunlight spilling through the living room windows. The first thing I noticed was not the silence. It was the tiny stuffed bear tucked carefully between my fingers, its faded brown fur worn soft by years of bedtime hugs. I stared at it without moving. Then I felt the blanket. Someone had covered me with a small blue fleece blanket that barely reached my shoulders, the kind decorated with little white clouds that belonged in a child's bedroom, not across the chest of a man who owned half the city. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. That surprised me more than anything. Usually, waking unexpectedly meant another crisis waiting at the door. Today, all I saw was a crayon drawing folded neatly on the coffee table beside my untouched espresso. I reached for the paper with unusual care. Across the front, written in uneven letters that wandered across the page, were 4 simple words. "Sleep good, Mr. Adrian." Beneath the message was a smiling stick figure tucked under a blanket beside a bright yellow sun. My throat tightened before I understood why. I had received contracts worth millions of dollars. Awards. Expensive gifts from powerful people hoping to earn my favor. None of them had ever made my hands shake like a piece of construction paper covered in green crayon. A soft gasp came from across the room. Emily stood frozen beside her cleaning cart, one hand covering her mouth while the other still held a feather duster. Her face turned pale the moment she realized I was awake. She hurried forward, lowering her voice as though afraid even the walls might judge her. "I am so sorry, Mr. Romano. I only looked away for a minute. Noah knows he is not supposed to bother anyone while they are sleeping." I looked toward the hallway instead of answering. Tiny footsteps shuffled uncertainly behind the corner before a small face peeked into the room. Noah clutched another stuffed animal almost as big as his chest. His curly blonde hair stuck up in every direction, and his blue eyes searched my expression with cautious curiosity instead of fear. Emily knelt beside him immediately. "Sweetheart, come here. You should not have gone into the living room without asking." Noah frowned, looking from his mother back to me. "But you said tired people need blankets," he answered quietly. He looked colder than Grandpa used to. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, clearly embarrassed. "I know what I said, honey." Noah lowered his head. "Did I do something bad?" The question settled over the room with surprising weight. I looked down at the tiny blanket still covering me, then back at the little bear resting in my hand. Nobody had tucked me in since I was a child. Nobody had thought I looked lonely enough to need comforting. Not employees. Not business partners. Certainly not strangers. Yet this little boy had walked across one of the most intimidating homes in Manhattan carrying nothing except kindness he believed should be shared. I slowly shook my head and met Noah's worried eyes. "No," I said, my voice quieter than either of us expected. "You did something I had almost forgotten people still knew how to do." Noah smiled with immediate relief, the kind only children could give without reservation, and in that single innocent smile, something inside the walls I had spent decades building developed its very first crack. I could not remember the last time anyone had looked at me without calculating something. Every meeting carried expectations. Every handshake measured influence. Every conversation ended with a request hidden beneath polite words. Yet Noah simply walked closer, hugging his stuffed rabbit with both arms as though the moment had already been settled in his mind. Emily gently reached for his shoulder. "Come here, sweetheart. Mr. Romano needs to get back to work." Noah looked up at me before answering. "Does he always work?" The question landed with surprising force. Emily gave an apologetic smile. "Sometimes children ask questions they should not." "No," I replied quietly. "Sometimes children ask the ones everyone else forgets." Noah tilted his head. "My mommy says people get grumpy when they do not sleep." A faint smile appeared before I could stop it. "Your mother is probably right." His eyes grew wider with curiosity. "Do you have a mommy?" Emily inhaled sharply. "Noah." She sounded horrified. "That is enough." I raised one hand before she could apologize again. "It is all right." I looked back at the little boy. I did. Noah waited patiently, as children often did when they sensed a story hiding behind simple words. "She used to tell me that strong people still needed rest," I said slowly. "I never listened very well." Noah nodded as if that explained everything. My grandpa did not listen either. The room fell quiet. Emily looked down for a brief second before speaking. "My father passed away last year." I understood immediately why Noah had mentioned him. The little blanket. The careful way he had covered me. The words about looking cold. He had not been pretending to take care of a stranger. He had simply repeated an act of love someone else had once given his grandfather. Children remembered kindness longer than adults remembered success. Noah walked to the coffee table and picked up the empty espresso cup. He studied it seriously before asking, "Do you like milk?" I blinked. "Sometimes." Grandpa smiled more when Mommy put milk in his coffee. Emily laughed softly despite herself. "He is trying to fix everything today." Noah looked proud of that description. People smile when things are fixed. I found myself leaning back against the sofa instead of standing. My schedule had been planned down to the minute. A conference call in 20 minutes. A financial review after that. Dinner with investors in the evening. Suddenly, every appointment seemed strangely distant compared to one curious little boy explaining how the world should work. Noah climbed onto the armchair across from me without being asked, swinging his legs because they were too short to reach the floor. "Your house is really big," he observed. "Does it get lonely?" Emily closed her eyes. "Noah, please." I answered before she could stop him. "Sometimes." He looked around the enormous living room with complete honesty. "Our apartment is tiny, but Mommy says tiny places can still feel full if everybody stays close." His words lingered in the quiet air long after he finished speaking. I glanced across the room at floor-to-ceiling windows, imported artwork, polished marble, and furniture collected from around the world. Everything had been chosen for perfection. Nothing had ever been chosen for comfort. For years I had believed success meant building walls nobody could cross. Somehow a 3-year-old had walked through every one of them carrying nothing except a faded stuffed rabbit and a heart too innocent to recognize the difference between a billionaire and a man who simply looked tired. As Noah smiled at me again, I realized something far more unsettling than any business problem waiting on my phone. For the first time in many years, I was not thinking about protecting what I had built. I was wondering what it might feel like to finally belong somewhere inside it. That evening, after Emily and Noah had gone home, the mansion felt larger than it ever had before. The silence returned, but it no longer felt ordinary. It felt noticeable. I stood alone in the living room, staring at the tiny blue blanket folded neatly across the back of the sofa. My house manager had probably intended to put it away with the rest of the children's belongings. Instead, I picked it up before anyone else could touch it. The fabric still carried the faint scent of baby shampoo and fresh laundry, a simple, familiar smell that somehow reached places inside me expensive cologne and polished marble never could. My phone vibrated again. 12 missed calls. 23 unread messages. My chief of staff had even left 3 voicemails asking if everything was all right. I pressed one button and typed a reply with unusual brevity. Reschedule every meeting until tomorrow afternoon. Within seconds, my phone rang again. I declined the call without hesitation. A few years ago, I would have considered that impossible. Tonight, it felt necessary. I walked slowly toward the library, passing family portraits that had hung on the walls for decades. Business awards filled glass shelves. Framed magazine covers praised my accomplishments. Yet none of those displays made me stop. Instead, my eyes settled on a single photograph tucked quietly into the back corner of an old bookshelf. I had not looked at it in years. My mother smiled at the camera while resting one hand on the shoulder of a boy no older than 7. Me. We sat together on a faded brown couch that had long since disappeared. I remembered that blanket. Different color. Different pattern. The same gentle hands pulling it over my shoulders after I pretended to stay awake just to hear one more bedtime story. I could almost hear her voice again. Sleep is not weakness, Adrian. Even the strongest hearts need somewhere safe to rest. I closed my eyes as the memory settled over me. I had buried those words beneath years of responsibility, ambition, and loneliness until they became impossible to hear. Somehow a 3-year-old child had uncovered them in less than 5 minutes. There was a soft knock at the library door. My head of security, Daniel Brooks, stepped inside. He had worked beside me for nearly 12 years and rarely commented on anything outside business. Tonight, he hesitated. Sir, I noticed you canceled tomorrow morning. I did. He nodded once, but did not leave. Is everything all right? I almost answered with the usual response. Everything is under control. Instead, I surprised both of us. Daniel, when was the last time you had breakfast with your family? He blinked. Last Sunday. Did you enjoy it? A slow smile crossed his face. More than any meeting I attended all week. I looked back at the old photograph still resting in my hands. Take tomorrow morning off. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Sir, go have breakfast with them again. He stared at me for several seconds before quietly saying, Thank you. After he left, I remained alone with the picture. Outside, the city lights stretched across the skyline like countless stars resting on the earth. I had spent years believing leadership meant carrying every burden by myself. Yet today, a little boy had offered me a stuffed bear, a blanket, and 4 crooked words written in green crayon. Sleep good, Mr. Adrian. Those words echoed through the empty mansion far louder than any business call ever had. And for the first time since my mother's voice faded from my life, I realized I wanted this house to remember what kindness sounded like. I arrived downstairs earlier than usual the next morning. Sunlight poured through the eastern windows, warming the marble floor with soft golden light instead of the cold reflections I had grown accustomed to seeing. The kitchen staff paused for a moment when I entered. Normally breakfast was delivered to my office without a word. Today I surprised everyone, including myself. Set 1 extra place at the table, I said. The head chef blinked. Are you expecting a guest, sir? I looked toward the doorway leading to the service hallway. Yes. 30 minutes later, I heard the familiar squeak of Emily's cleaning cart rolling across the entrance hall. Noah's cheerful voice followed close behind, humming a tune only he seemed to understand. When Emily stepped into the dining room and saw the table prepared for 3 instead of 1, she stopped so suddenly that Noah nearly bumped into her leg. "Mr. Romano," she said carefully, "I hope there is not a problem." "There is not," I answered. "Would the two of you have breakfast with me?" Emily looked genuinely startled. "That is very kind, but we should not. We are here to work." Before I could respond, Noah tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mommy," he remembered breakfast. Emily glanced down at him, then back at me. She seemed uncertain whether accepting would cross an invisible line neither of us had ever discussed. Finally, she gave a small nod. Only for a few minutes. Noah climbed into the chair beside mine without hesitation, his feet swinging happily beneath the oversized dining table that could comfortably seat 20 people. Looking at him, there made the room feel completely different. For years, this table had hosted negotiations, celebrations, and formal dinners where every word carried weight. Now a 3-year-old was studying a stack of pancakes with complete concentration, as though deciding where to begin was the most important choice in the world. "Can I have blueberries?" he asked. The chef hurried forward immediately. "Of course." Noah smiled brightly. "Thank you, Mr. Cook." Several members of the kitchen staff exchanged amused glances. Most people thanked me before they thanked anyone else. Noah thanked the man bringing him fruit. Emily noticed it too. "We always say thank you," she explained softly. "My father believed gratitude costs nothing but changes everything." I nodded slowly. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she answered, her smile carrying both warmth and quiet sadness. Breakfast unfolded in peaceful conversation unlike anything this dining room had ever witnessed. Noah proudly explained why dinosaurs would make terrible house pets because they would eat too many pancakes. Emily apologized each time he interrupted, and each time I assured her no apology was necessary. I found myself laughing more than speaking. The sound felt unfamiliar coming from my own voice. Halfway through the meal, Noah suddenly looked around the enormous room. "Why do you eat here all alone?" he asked. Emily nearly dropped her coffee cup. "Noah." He looked confused. "What?" "I was just asking." I rested my fork on the plate before answering. "Because I got used to it." Noah considered that answer for several seconds. Before tearing a piece from his pancake, he reached across the table with his tiny hand and placed it gently onto my plate. "You do not have to get used to it anymore." The room became perfectly still. Even the staff quietly looked away, pretending to organize dishes so they could give me privacy. I stared at the small piece of pancake resting beside my untouched breakfast. It was not the food that mattered. It was the invitation. Children never measured generosity by size. They measured it by sincerity. I looked at Noah, then at Emily, whose eyes glistened as she watched her son unknowingly offer something no amount of money had ever purchased for me. A place at someone else's table, not because of my name, not because of my success, but simply because no one, in the mind of a little boy, should ever have to eat breakfast alone. The rest of that week settled into a rhythm none of us had planned. Emily continued caring for the mansion with the same quiet professionalism she had always shown, but something inside these walls had shifted. The staff smiled more often. Conversations sounded warmer. Even the echoes in the long hallways seemed softer whenever Noah's laughter drifted through the house. I noticed myself looking toward the front entrance every morning, listening for the familiar squeak of the cleaning cart, followed by small running footsteps. I had spent years believing routines were built by schedules. Noah proved they were built by people. One rainy afternoon, dark clouds covered Manhattan and steady drops tapped against the tall windows. Most children would have complained about staying indoors. Noah treated the mansion like an unexplored castle. Every room became another adventure, every hallway another discovery. Emily was polishing the grand staircase when Noah wandered into my study carrying a box of colored pencils under one arm. He stopped in front of the enormous bookshelf lining the far wall and looked up with wide eyes. "Have you read all of these?" he asked. I looked away from the paperwork spread across my desk. "Most of them." His eyebrows lifted in amazement. "That is a lot of bedtime stories." I laughed quietly. "Some of them are not. Very good bedtime stories." He thought for a moment before choosing one of the empty leather chairs across from my desk. Without asking permission, he climbed onto it, opened a blank sheet of drawing paper, and began coloring with complete concentration. We sat together in comfortable silence. I reviewed contracts while he carefully decided whether the sun should be orange or yellow. Strangely, neither of us seemed bothered by the absence of conversation. Emily eventually stepped into the doorway carrying folded towels. She froze for a moment at the sight before her. Noah drawing peacefully, me working without looking at my phone every 30 seconds. She smiled to herself, though she probably believed neither of us noticed. Noah, she said gently, we should let Mr. Romano finish his work. He shook his head without looking up. I am helping. Emily looked confused. Helping how? Noah answered with complete confidence. People work better when somebody is with them. His words settled over the room with quiet simplicity. Emily gave me an apologetic look. I promise he is not trying to interrupt you. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the colorful picture slowly taking shape beneath Noah's tiny hands. He is not interrupting anything. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been on her mind for days. May I ask you something? I nodded. Of course. She folded her hands together. Why have you been so kind to us? I looked toward the rain sliding down the windows before answering honestly. Because your son reminded me that kindness is not something people earn. It is something they choose. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, visibly moved. Most people only notice what you can do for them. That used to be true in my world too, I admitted. Noah suddenly jumped down from the chair and walked proudly to my desk. He held up his drawing with both hands. It showed 3 stick figures standing beneath a bright blue sky. One was very tall. One had long blonde hair. The smallest one stood in the middle, holding both of their hands. Above them he had written, with uneven green letters, my happy friends. I stared at the drawing longer than I intended. Emily smiled softly. That is us, sweetheart. Noah nodded enthusiastically. Families hold hands. Then he paused, studying my face with the same innocent honesty he always carried. Friends can too if they are lonely. No business agreement I had ever signed carried as much weight as those simple words. And as the rain continued falling outside, I realized the fortress I had spent a lifetime building was slowly becoming something I had never expected it to be. A place where coming home finally meant someone was waiting inside. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees beyond the mansion with shades of amber and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Weeks had passed since Noah first draped that little blue blanket over me. Yet every morning I still found myself wondering what unexpected lesson he might bring through the front door. Life inside the mansion had changed in ways no renovation or expensive artwork ever could. Staff members lingered to exchange greetings instead of rushing silently between rooms. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table because Emily said every home deserved something alive inside it. Even I had started leaving my office door open more often than closed. One Friday afternoon, I finished a meeting earlier than expected and walked into the garden behind the estate. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves and freshly cut grass. Noah sat beneath the old maple tree surrounded by colorful chalk, carefully drawing on the stone patio while Emily trimmed rose bushes nearby. The moment he spotted me, his face lit up. Mr. Adrian, come see. I walked over, curious. Across the patio, he had drawn 3 large hearts connected by winding blue lines that looked like rivers. What is this? I asked. Noah pointed proudly. That is Mommy. That is me. That is you. I smiled. And the blue lines? He answered as though it were obvious. Those are hugs you cannot see. Emily laughed softly from behind the roses. He thinks love travels even when people are standing far apart. I looked down at the drawing for several quiet seconds. Children had a remarkable way of explaining complicated truths with astonishing simplicity. Before I could answer, Noah looked toward the large swing hanging from one of the maple branches. Will you push me? I hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. He climbed onto the wooden seat, gripping the ropes with tiny hands while I gently pushed him forward. His laughter echoed across the garden, bright and effortless, carrying farther than the wind itself. Emily watched from a distance, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. There was relief in her eyes, but also something else. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. When Noah finally slowed the swing, he looked back at me with flushed cheeks and a wide grin. Higher next time, he declared confidently. Maybe, I answered with a laugh. Emily walked over, handing Noah his water bottle before turning to me. I have never seen him trust someone this quickly. I looked at the little boy sipping water beneath the afternoon sun. I think he decided who I was long before I figured it out myself. Emily lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Children usually see the person before they notice the reputation. Her words stayed with me long after she returned to her gardening. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Noah gathered his chalk drawings into a small cardboard box. Just before leaving, he stopped beside me and slipped something into my hand. It was a smooth maple leaf, bright red with golden edges. "Keep it," he whispered. "So you remember today." I carefully placed the leaf inside the pocket of my jacket as though it were more valuable than anything locked inside the mansion's vault. Watching Emily buckle Noah into his car seat a few minutes later, I realized the hardest lessons in life were never taught in boardrooms or written inside contracts. They arrived wearing tiny sneakers, carrying colored chalk, and believing invisible hugs could travel farther than fear ever could. As their car disappeared beyond the front gates, the garden suddenly felt quieter again, but this time the silence no longer felt empty. It simply waited patiently for the sound of little footsteps to return. Winter arrived with the first light snowfall, covering the garden's outside Romano Manor in a quiet blanket of white that softened every sharp edge. The world beyond the gates continued moving at its usual relentless pace, but inside the mansion, something slower and gentler had taken root. The dining room no longer echoed with lonely meals. The library no longer felt like a place where silence lived alone. Even the staff admitted the house seemed warmer, though the thermostat had not changed by a single degree. One Saturday morning, Emily arrived carrying grocery bags in one hand, while Noah proudly held a small paper bag against his chest. His cheeks were pink from the cold, and tiny snowflakes clung to the shoulders of his little blue coat before melting away. The moment he spotted me standing near the fireplace, he hurried across the entrance hall. "Mr. Adrian, I brought you something." He carefully opened the paper bag and revealed 3 homemade sugar cookies shaped like stars. They were uneven, slightly overbaked, and decorated with enough colorful icing to make every professional baker shake their head. "Mommy let me help," he announced proudly. Emily smiled with quiet embarrassment. He insisted the first batch had to come here. I accepted the bag as though it contained priceless treasures. "Thank you, Noah. They look perfect." He grinned. "The blue one is your favorite." I laughed softly. "How did you know blue was my favorite?" Noah shrugged. "Because your blanket was blue." Emily looked at me with surprised eyes, only then realizing I had kept that little fleece blanket instead of putting it away. I nodded toward the living room, where it still rested neatly folded across the sofa. Some gifts deserve a permanent place. Later that afternoon, snow continued falling beyond the windows while Noah built a castle from wooden blocks on the living room rug. I sat beside him wearing rolled-up shirt sleeves instead of a suit jacket, something my staff had almost never seen. Every time one tower leaned too far, Noah simply smiled and rebuilt it. "You are not upset?" I asked after another section collapsed. He shook his head. "No. Now I know how to make it stronger." I looked at the scattered blocks spread across the floor. I wish adults remembered that. Emily, dusting the bookshelf nearby, paused when she heard those words. "Sometimes adults forget that starting over is not the same as failing," she said quietly. I looked at her, realizing she was speaking from experience as much as offering advice. Noah reached for another block and placed it carefully into my hand. "Your turn." Together we rebuilt the little castle one piece at a time until it stood taller than before. When we finished, Noah clapped proudly. "See? It is better now." I smiled at the tiny structure in front of us, understanding he was no longer talking about wooden blocks. As evening settled over Manhattan, the fireplace filled the room with gentle warmth while soft music drifted from hidden speakers. Noah eventually curled up beside me on the sofa, fighting sleep with determined little blinks before finally losing the battle. His head rested lightly against my arm, his breathing slow and peaceful. Emily stepped closer, ready to carry him home, but I quietly reached for the familiar blue blanket resting across the back of the sofa. Without saying a word, I gently covered him just as he had once covered me. Emily watched with glistening eyes and whispered, "He was right." I looked up. "About what?" She smiled through quiet emotion. "People really do sleep better when somebody cares enough to tuck them in." At that moment, I realized the greatest changes in life rarely arrived with loud announcements. Sometimes they appeared one small kindness at a time until, almost without noticing, a lonely house became a home, and a lonely heart finally remembered how to rest. Spring arrived almost without anyone noticing. The snow disappeared from the gardens, replaced by fresh green grass and rows of flowers Emily had planted with Noah months before. Their colors stretched across the estate like quiet reminders that every season eventually gives way to another. Looking out from the library window one early morning, I realized the mansion no longer felt like the place I had inherited. It felt like the place we had slowly built together, not with stone or money, but with breakfast shared around an oversized table, crayon drawings taped inside desk drawers, bedtime, blankets folded carefully across a familiar sofa, and the unmistakable sound of one little boy laughing somewhere down the hall. Noah burst through the open doorway carrying a tiny watering can almost as large as his legs. "Mr. Adrian," he called, slightly out of breath. "The flowers are thirsty." I closed the folder in front of me without reading another page and stood immediately. Months ago, I would have finished every document before stepping outside. Today, the flowers seemed more important. We spent the next half hour watering the garden together while Emily trimmed fresh blooms nearby. Noah talked without stopping, explaining that flowers grew better when people complimented them. Every few steps he leaned down and whispered, "You are doing a great job," to another bright blossom. I finally asked, "Do you really think they can hear you?" He smiled as though the answer was obvious. "Maybe not with ears, but everything grows better with kindness." I looked toward Emily, who simply smiled and shrugged. He has believed that since he learned how to talk. As we finished, Noah slipped his small hand into mine. His fingers barely wrapped around one of mine, yet the gesture carried a quiet certainty that words could never match. We walked back toward the house together beneath the warm afternoon sun. Halfway across the garden path, Noah stopped and looked up at me with complete seriousness. "Can I tell you a secret?" I knelt so we were eye level. "Always." He leaned closer and whispered, "I used to think this house was too big because it felt empty." He looked around at the open windows, the blooming gardens, and the front door where Emily stood waiting for us with a gentle smile. Then he looked back into my eyes. "Now it feels little because it feels full." My vision blurred before I could stop it. I swallowed hard, but the emotion remained. Noah reached up and placed his tiny hand against my cheek. "Do not cry." I smiled through the tears anyway. Sometimes happy people cry too. He nodded thoughtfully before wrapping both little arms around my neck in the kind of hug only a child could give, complete with absolute trust. "You do not have to sleep alone anymore," he whispered. I closed my eyes, holding him carefully as the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the garden. Across the path, Emily quietly wiped a tear from her own cheek before pretending to admire the roses. In that moment, I understood something I had spent an entire lifetime searching for in all the wrong places. Strength was never measured by how much a person could carry alone. Real strength was allowing someone else's kindness to reach the places pride had locked away for years. A little boy had walked into my life carrying a worn stuffed bear, a blue blanket, and a heart untouched by fear. He never asked for anything in return, yet he gave me the one thing money, influence, and success had never been able to buy: a home. And every time I pass that old sofa, I still see a folded blue blanket waiting there, reminding me that sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest healing, and the quietest acts of love become the moments that change a life forever.